I'm interested in mechanical devices, particularly spring-wound devices like clocks and phonographs, more specifically. And believe it or not, there's actually quite a bit of common ground between these two items. And that's what we're going to look at here in this video. I hope to keep it kind of short. Is the overlap in clocks and phonographs, specifically Seth Thomas clocks and Edison phonographs, and then in a moment we'll look at an interesting crossover with a Waterbury clock. But what we're looking at right here is a bank protection clock that uses a Seth Thomas number 10 movement. And this is an interesting movement in that it has two mainsprings that drive a common shaft between them, a common second wheel. So you have twice the drive torque that you would of a normal 8-day clock. And as a consequence, it's able to operate a lot of heavy drag auxiliaries. And it was quite common for this movement to be used by companies using this movement for some commercial purpose. And then it's an interesting movement. If we take a look at a Seth Thomas Kellogg here, and I've got a reprint, although it's falling apart, reprint of the 1892-1893 Seth Thomas Kellogg. Interesting ad copy there. Here's a picture of Seth Thomas's exhibit at the Exposition Universelle in Paris, 1878. A very interesting year. A lot of these movements were introduced at that exposition, including our good old number 10 movement, which is shown duplicated here on either side in this display for symmetry, as well as several other movements. And we'll look at a few representative examples of clocks which would have housed the number 10. Sure, the 8-day versions of this clock held a number 10. The 8-day versions of this clock had a number 10. Same with this one. And same with this one. Another use of a number 10 movement is one that is the reason for me making this video, is one where the phonographs and clocks overlap. And let's take a look at the number 10 a little closer. This isn't a complete number 10, this is a pretty derelict movement here. You hear one that's complete ticking away. This is one that's been pieced out for parts, but it's the only other number 10 movement I've got, and I don't want to take this apart just to make a video. This would have had two mainspring barrels, one on each side of the center wheel here, driving a common second wheel arbor. You can see the very large lantern pinion there of the second wheel. It's reinforced. It even has a brass hub that runs all the way through instead of just two end discs with the pins in. And then that drives the second wheel, which drives the third or center wheel, which, as you can see, the wheel itself in this example is missing. Just the lantern pinion and arbor are still present. And of course, going up the train would have been the third wheel, or not third wheel, the fourth wheel. the fifth wheel, which would have carried a seconds hand in some models. And if you look closely in this clock, you can see the fifth wheel is extended for a seconds hand to be placed. Get a good view of this thing running here. And the verge would be carried through here. One end of the verge is fixed, and the other end of the verge can be adjusted. There's the banking pins, and then the balance wheel would go between these two cut bearings here. Okay, I said there was an overlap between the Seth Thomas number 10 and phonograph. So if we look in here, these are the only pictures I have. That's why I'm making this video, and I appreciate some better pictures from somebody. We have the very first version of the Edison home model phonograph. This predates the Model A home. And this is the model that's generally known as the Clockwork Home. And as you can see, the bed plate and top works are pretty much the same as what's used in the Model A. You see the pulley there is quite a bit larger. The cabinet has a drawer, and the winding crank comes out closer to the middle of the cabinet on the side. Other than that, it looks pretty much like a suitcase Model A. When we take a look at the motor, this is the only picture there is of the motor. It doesn't look like a phonograph motor with its cast iron and steel construction. It looks more like a clock movement. Now the text of the book here says that the motors were made by the United States Phonograph Company of New Jersey. I have a feeling more likely that they were modified by the United States Phonograph Company of New Jersey. Looking at these pictures here, I believe this is a Seth Thomas number 10 movement that's been modified to be a phonograph motor. We have the two main spring barrels driving the second wheel, drives the third wheel. The belt pulley is on the fourth wheel, and I imagine the governor is probably on the probably where the fifth wheel would be, on the fifth wheel arbor. The arrangement of the movement is unmistakable, and we'll even look at the holes in the back plate here and identify them in the photo. This would be the unused holes like what's used here on the front plate, because they use the same plates for the front and the back, or at least on this particular movement. And this movement is probably from about the same time era as that is. Maybe a little bit later. But based on the markings on the movement and comparing them with other Seth Thomas movements, I know the dates for. I'd say this is an 1890s to about 1910 era movement. There wasn't a whole lot of change. So this is the hole for the screw that holds the cock over the winding ratchet. And here it is on this movement. Then this hole is the hole for the click rivet. There it is there. And these two holes are the holes for the flat click spring, which is just riveted into the plate of the movement. And that would be these two here. And notice the detail, the small hole and the large hole. Here we have a small hole and a large hole. And everything else is pretty much exactly where you would expect it to be. And you can even see the holes on the other side of the movement back plate here. And then there's the second wheel with the curved spokes, just like they are here. Only thing I don't see is an unused hole right there, which would be this one here, which is for, this is a stud for the motion work gearing, which drives the hands. And it seems like that's been omitted, although it's hard to say in this photo if it's there or not. I think actually it is there if you look closely. I think that's it right there. So again, it's hard to tell. I would love to have some better photos, but I believe that's what that is a Seth Thomas Model 10 movement. Now, Seth Thomas was really good about stamping their movements with their name. Even if you used it for some other purpose, obviously you probably bought it from them, and then you modified it in your own shops, or had them build it with some modifications from the factory, but it would still have the Seth Thomas stamp and the Thomaston, Connecticut. There were other companies that made copies of Seth Thomas movements. I have a movement that is one of these. It's a copy of the Seth Thomas time and strike movement that's used in a Hartford electric time switch. It looks very much like a Seth Thomas movement at a glance, but you notice that it's not stamped with the Seth Thomas name, and the escapement is different. And looking at the clock and looking at some of the details on it that are manufacturer specific, it looks like it's either a Waterbury or a New Haven clock that's not been stamped. So it's very possible that that what it is a copy of a Seth Thomas number 10. I'm sure there were other American clock companies who copied the Seth Thomas Model 10 movement for use in their own clocks. But since there's so very few of these that exist, it would be sure interesting to see one, to see what kind of markings are at. I also noticed in this picture you can just barely see the hole there for the balance wheel cup bearing screws. Okay, so that's a Seth Thomas Edison connection there. Alright, trying to keep this video on the short side, so bear with me. Let's go on to another American clock company. We'll move some things around here. This is a Waterbury movement. This is a movement out of a Waterbury alarm clock. They made this same basic movement with minor changes here and there, and even some wholesale changes to the way the gears are arranged, but the plates stay basically the same from the 1890s to the 1940s. This came out of a Waterbury thrift alarm clock, which dates to the 20s. Is a model that has a bell on the top. These came in several variations, and the movements are mounted in the cases in several different ways. And And the alarm section of this movement has been removed. There's a time dial side. So let's look at a phonograph that uses a Waterbury alarm clock movement. So this is a excellent little book here. It's the Talking Machine Compendium. I got this at Harrods in London when I was there in 1997. And on page 38 is a metaphone made by Edward Emmett. And if we look at the motor for this metaphone, we notice some things. Notice it bears a very strong resemblance to the Waterbury, and it takes a little bit of fiddling with this movement here to get it in the right position where the holes match the holes on the motor in the picture. But if we hold the movement this way with the balance wheel down, the shape of the plates match almost perfectly. You can see, looking at the pictures of this motor and looking at the movement, that this is clearly based off of a time-only version of this movement. I can even go so far as to set this movement down and pick out some things in the picture. And compare them with the Waterbury movement here. So in various versions of this movement, there's a variety of different arrangements. This little finger sticking out here can be drilled through, and then an arbor put through there with a pinion that has the same number of leaves as the fourth wheel pinion, and then that gives you a seconds hand. Since these plates are the same front and back, this is where the stud is for the motion work on the front side. Of course, there's the train wheel arbors. Looking at some of these other holes here to try to identify them. Obviously, some of these aren't used in this model even, like that hole there. We come down here and look at this movement. We see the same shapes to the plates. The Waterbury has this bulge on either side of the center arbor. And looking at this movement here that's used as a phonograph motor, we see those same bulges. We see the finger for the motion works. We see the unused hole that the alarm clock movement has, and this hole is for the stud that pins the hairspring. There's the hole for the balance wheel bearing. This piece here that's bossed out like this would be where the pivot goes for the verge, the lever. And then above it, right here, is the escape wheel, where the escape wheel goes. And obviously this is the third wheel right here. And it looks to me that the governor takes the place of the fourth wheel and is mounted such that it sticks out a little bit. And indeed, you can see that by judicious choosing of where you mount the governor at, if you mounted a little bracket onto the edge of the movement for the outboard bearing of the governor at the motor end, that it would be very easy to drive a governor pinion off of the third wheel. And then obviously this is for that seconds hand arbor that I'd mentioned earlier. You can see the other side of it there. So very obviously to me, even though it doesn't look like it's marked, at least not in this photo, this is a Waterbury alarm clock movement. And possibly an earlier version of this. This basic movement ran for a long time. I'm sure there were very subtle modifications made to it here and there. Judging by the way this movement looks, it doesn't have some of the extra items for the alarm. So it's probably a time-only movement. You can see the way the shape of the plate is, that it's obvious that this line just carries across more or less, or maybe doesn't come up as far, so that the movement can be shorter. Or if it's mounted like this, not as wide, but more likely shorter. The movement here on this machine is closer to square than this one is. But the overall layout, it's very clearly a Waterbury movement, a movement made by the same manufacturer. The way, if you was to look at another movement, like by a New Haven or an Ingraham, all these little details would be different. Each manufacturer had their own approach to movement design. And that's one of the neat things about American clocks is they're all so very similar, but the details are usually different. Some of the movements are very interesting, and some of them are very vanilla. So that's my little video on the overlap between horology and phonographs. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.